Hello and welcome to Podcast Pete's podcast, where I, the aforementioned Podcast Pete, talk about podcasts and podcasting, giving you real practical tips when it comes to making, publishing, marketing and monetizing your podcast. I am only of interest to you if you're looking at creating a professional sounding podcast and you're wanting to attract the biggest audience that you can. Plus, as always, we give another shout out to another podcaster a little bit later on, so keep listening out for that. If you've got a question or you just fancy a chat, you can get in touch on the Facebook page. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at PodcastPete2, or you can email therealpodcastpete@gmail.com. So this week I want to talk about reviving your podcast. And the reason I'm doing this is because I've had a couple of people talk to me about this recently, about them reviving their own podcast. And I thought, well, okay, if they're talking about it, other people must be talking about it. Let's do an episode on it. So this is the scenario that I'm talking about. Let's say you started a podcast, maybe it was a few months ago, maybe even years ago, but then you stopped. And you stopped, I don't know, for whatever reason. You got a cat, or, you know, Tiger King came on Netflix, or something shiny went past your window. Whatever it was that made you think, okay, I'm stopping now. You've stopped. And only now have you got around to the idea of starting it back up again. Now, of course, in the meantime, since you've been doing all of that and going about your life, your podcast is still out there. You've still been paying the hosting fees. You've still been, it's still been out there on platforms. It's on Apple, it's on Spotify. It can still be found. It can still be listened to. You've just not created any new content for it for months. So what's the plan? Is the plan that you're going to create brand new content, or are you just planning to pick up where you left off? So when I say new content, as in maybe a different format than you were doing before, maybe, completely different content than what you were doing before. Because if it's new content that you're going to be creating rather than just picking up where you left off, could it be considered a brand new podcast? And I only offer that as an option because it might be something that the audience you've built up with your old podcast, they might not be into what you're offering this time around. And also, a brand new podcast, there's something really exciting about that. It's a chance to refresh, to rebrand, to learn from the lessons that you've gained from the first podcast. And with a new podcast, there is no embarrassing early episodes where you were just learning the craft and finding your way. I've said before, there's a podcast that I did called the Puppy Podcast. And I finished, the last episode of that was in June of 2019. That's still out there, though, still gets new listeners, still gets new subscribers. But the early episodes are pretty poor because it was my first ever podcast. So if I was going to do a new one, possibly about my dogs, I'd be thinking about maybe just starting again. Because then there isn't those old embarrassing episodes. Of course, there's a flip side to that, and I'm going to talk about that more in a minute or so. First of all, it's time for the podcast shout out. And that is where I'm a grown man. That is where I give a different podcast a bit of time to tell you about their podcast. And that could become your new favourite podcast, apart from this one, obviously. So, for this podcast shout out, I'm going to hand you over to Paul.
Hi, this is Colin Ferguson. I play Sheriff Jack Carter on Eureka.
Hi, this is Bernard Robichaud. I play Cyrus on the Trailer Park Boys.
Hey there, it's Adam Curry from the No Agenda Show.
Hi, this is Jeremy Bullock, Boba Fett from the first Star Wars trilogy.
This is Father Robert Vallis here.
Hello, this is Brian Brushwood, host of Scam School, and I dreamed the dream of the perfect book show
When I woke up, it was the Book Guys. And you're listening to The Book Guys.
Book guys.
Book guys. The book guys.
You're listening to the Book Guys.
The Book Guys Show, where we talk about books, audiobooks, audio dramas, podcasts, film and television, you name it. We're about more than just books. Search for Book Guys Show today in your favorite podcast app.
Hey, Paul.
Wait, who said that?
This is Orson Scott Card. I thought I was the book guy. Now I find out you're the book guy. What am I? Oh, I guess I'm just the author of Ender's Game. Okay.
Thanks very much, Paul. So the podcast is called The Book Show. I'll post links in the show notes. God, I love books. And I've switched to audiobooks more in recent times, but I've got a stack of books by the side of my bed. That occasionally I'll go, okay, I'll do a chapter, and I forget how much I love that physical act of reading. My favourite book of all time is by Susanna Clarke. It's called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. It is superb. The BBC did a TV adaptation of it, which wasn't great, and it was a shame. But it was mainly because it's such a complicated story and such a wide-ranging story. There was no way they were going to be able to kind of compress it all into 7-hour episodes. I mean, the audiobook is 32 hours long. Anyway, so yes, The Book Show, links will be in the show notes. If you want to have your podcast featured on the podcast shout-out, then all you need to do is send me a 30 to 60 second audio clip of you talking about your podcast, and just send it to therealpodcastpete@gmail.com, and you will be featured in a future episode. All right, back to reviving your podcast. So the flip side to starting a brand new podcast rather than reviving your old one is that with the old one, you've got an audience that knows you, that have either started making that connection with you or have made that connection with you. And many of those people who subscribed on Apple Podcasts or followed you on Spotify, they will still be subscribed or following you, because if something isn't creating new content, what you generally tend to do is just go and find a new podcast. You don't go, well, I'm going to unsubscribe from them, I'm going to stop following them. You just kind of forget about it. So if you do create new content for that old podcast, and revive it, there's a chance they're going to be pleasantly surprised when a new episode drops onto their device. And for that reason, then you should maybe just carry on adding episodes to your old podcast. But, and it's a big but, I cannot lie, bonus point if you get the reference, if your new content differs from your old podcast, then again, we're back at this thing of you're not really looking at a revival, you're looking at a relaunch. And you've got to think about starting again from the beginning. So we're talking new logo, new music, right from the beginning. And that's because, and I'm going to go back to something that I've said a couple of times in previous episodes, listeners love spontaneity, but they do not like surprises. So what that means, and someone questioned this, they go, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, because those are two of the same things. They're really, really not. So spontaneity is something like bringing on an unexpected guest onto your podcast. Listeners love that kind of thing, or something similar. But what they don't like is it's a surprise when you've changed the format without warning, or you just stop creating new content without warning, making it a surprise. They don't like that. They've made this connection with you. They've trusted you with their listening time. And what they want from you is a bit of a heads up, as you would any relationship, any personal relationship that you have. You just want a heads up when things are going to be changing. So if the idea of reviving your podcast is actually based around a lot of new content, then what I would ask you do is to think about not reviving it, but relaunching it. Now, if you do go ahead and revive it, so if you've been doing your knitting podcast and you're coming back and you just want to talk about knitting some more, then yeah, absolutely revive it. And you add new episodes to your podcast. That first one back, after you'd stop creating content, just explain what's been going on. Do not start your episode as though nothing has happened, because you wouldn't treat your friends and family with that kind of lack of respect. So why do it to a group of people that you want to respect you and you want to make that connection with you? And I'm not saying you have to go into every little detail as to why you stopped creating content. Well, okay, we've been away for a while, and that's because, well, my brother, we had a bit of a falling out. It was something and nothing. There was a family thing, and he said something about my dad, and then we talked about it, and we had some problems at school when we were in school together, but we've kind of got to... You don't need to do that. But you explain what's been going on, as in, hi, everyone. Obviously, this is the first episode back. I've not been creating content for 12 months. A couple of things were going on in my life that meant I just couldn't commit to creating new content. That's changed now. I'm back. Here we go. There you go. You've explained it. And as a listener, I'll be like, okay, I get it now. You know, I understand it. Our relationship is back to a place of understanding. And I'm not saying, that it has to be a lengthy kind of thing where you're explaining. Just let me know what's going on. Explain why you're back. Something I was asked the other day, I was at a network meeting, and somebody I was talking to was talking about doing this exact thing, reviving their podcast, but they were saying they've not made any new content for years. And they were wondering, is there some kind of time limit on reviving your podcast? And I honestly don't think that there is. And the only thing I will say is that the longer it's been since your last original episode, the more you're going to have to shout about any new content that you create. Because that then loops back to the earlier point I was making, that there is and it's an unknown tipping point. That's the frustrating thing. You will know what this tipping point is, where launching a brand new podcast is probably the better option. So if the amount of effort you're having to put in to revive your podcast and tell people about it is more than it would take to launch a brand new one, then you might as well just launch a brand new one. Okay, that's all for this episode. If you've got any questions, if there's anything you want to get in touch about, if there's anything you want to say or question me about the stuff we've talked about in this episode or in any previous episodes, then you can get in touch. We're on Facebook. The Podcast Pete's podcast page is on Facebook. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Podcast Pete 2. Or you can email therealpodcastpete@gmail.com. That is also the email address you need if you want a podcast shout out, where I give you 30, 60 seconds to tell me about your podcast. That email address is where you send your 30 to 60 second audio clip. Send it to therealpodcastpete@gmail.com. Also, don't forget, if you're launching a new podcast, tell me about it, tag me in on it, and I will absolutely tell other people about it and share the news that you've got a podcast out, because it's great when new people start podcasting. It's great when people go back to podcasting. It's great that people are podcasting. So happy podcasting, whichever stage of the journey that you are in. Stay safe, be kind, and I'll see you next time.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.